I'm David Smith, and one of my jobs here at Calvin University is to direct the Kuyers Institute for Christian Teaching and Learning, which is a research institute which, as its name suggests, is focused on the relationship between Christianity and teaching and learning. It's existed since 2004, thanks to a generous gift by Milton Carroll Kuyers, hence the Kuyers Institute. This is the first of a series of 3 videos to explain a little about the Institute, what it is we do, what we're interested in, and which needles we're trying to move. And in this video, I'm going to focus on our core research function. We are a research institute, and we're interested in particular kinds of research. And I can explain this best perhaps through a research project that we carried out a few years ago, when we surveyed the literature that had been published over a 40-year period under the umbrella of Christian scholarship or integration of faith and learning. We looked for articles that had Christian editorial stances, Christian criteria for the scholarship that they published, and also some journals that just accepted articles from a variety of faiths. And we looked across the disciplines, 14 disciplines, 21 journals. And we ended up with about 10,000 articles in the pool of articles that we were surveying, published between 1970 and 2010. And for each article, we asked a very simple sorting question. So imagine you've got 10,000 pebbles to sort into 2 buckets. And as each pebble comes up, you ask, is it a teaching and learning article, or is it just a disciplinary scholarship article that doesn't mention teaching and learning? And we set the bar very low. So if we could find one paragraph in the article that mentioned students, teaching, learning, pedagogy, formation, any words like that that indicated a teaching focus, one paragraph got it in as a teaching and learning article. If we couldn't find that paragraph, it was a disciplinary scholarship article. Now, obviously in the education journals, we found quite a lot of teaching and learning articles. About 60% of them came out with a teaching and learning focus. There are other topics in education journals. But we also found that most of those articles did not reference higher education. They were focused on K-12 classrooms. And that there was very little exchange between those education articles and the wider Christian scholarship in higher education conversation. And when we looked at the broader array of disciplines, at these articles published over 40 years on Christian scholarship, we found just over 4% of them mentioning teaching, learning, students, pedagogy, formation, despite the fact that most Christian colleges and universities are primarily teaching institutions and have a strong focus on the kind of formation that they're offering for students. So 4% seemed a little low. And then as we dug a little deeper, we noticed that those disciplines that seem to have contributed most to steering what's usually been called the integration of faith and learning conversation had the least to say about teaching and learning, had the lowest numbers of articles that paid attention to how students were shaped in learning contexts. Now we can see some of the results of that in an article that came out in 2016 in Christian Scholars Review by some colleagues at Baylor University, Nathan Alleman and his colleagues. And in that article, they surveyed a little over 2,300 faculty at Christian colleges and universities across 48 different institutions, lots of different theological traditions. And one of the questions they asked them was what in their work was influenced by their theological tradition. And when they asked, does your theological tradition influence your worldview, your ethics, and your motivation for being in the academy? So the way you think about things, the way you frame your work, about 4 out of 5 faculty were saying, yes, my theological tradition has an influence on my worldview, it shapes my ethics, it gives me reasons for being a scholar. Whereas when they asked, does your theological tradition influence your approach to teaching and learning, only about 2 out of 5, about 40%, were saying, yes, there's an influence there from my theology to my teaching and learning. So you can't write that off as the people who didn't read the books and don't get that there's a connection between faith and learning, because it's the same people, 4 out of 5 of whom were saying, yes, my faith affects my worldview. So we see the same kind of disconnect going on there, where we've got this large literature that's about how faith relates to scholarly questions, to what we believe and how that affects the theories, and we come up with the knowledge that we arrive at. But really very little attention in the literature to faith related to teaching and learning, and also very little investment by faculty, comparatively speaking, in this question of how faith relates to teaching and learning. So that's the space that the Kuyers Institute exists to work into and to try to increase the amount of conversation that focuses on how does being Christian, how does having a Christian institution or a Christian teacher or a Christian student or Christian themes in your learning material, how does this affect the learning process? How does this change how people are shaped in learning settings? What's the interaction between learning a subject and classroom processes and the way I come to regard other people, my own faith formation, my own spiritual formation? How do we understand those kinds of things? So we tackle this in a number of ways. We sponsor research projects. We just finished a big project on how technology is used in Christian classrooms. There'll be a book, Digital Life Together, coming out in the near future. We've run projects on the history of how Christians have used biblical imagery to frame their understanding of teaching and learning and the kind of ideas that that's generated. We've looked at the role of Christian practices in classrooms. We try to connect with a wider range of scholars around this by running a conference every 2 years in October, first week in October, in odd-numbered years, in which we draw together scholars from around the country and from around the world to discuss these questions. How does Christian faith affect how you think about learning processes and the design of teaching, and how teaching and learning fits into Christian institutions or into the calling of Christian teachers. And we also publish a journal, the International Journal of Christianity and Education. It's published 3 times a year. It's published by SAGE. It's a mainstream journal, fully peer-reviewed in all the databases. And in this journal, we also seek to foster scholarship that at a high level is articulating the connections between Christian faith and how we understand and practice education. So the first emphasis for the Kuyers Institute, research. How do we understand better, in a more nuanced way, in a more complex way, in a more critical way, the ways in which faith informs, shapes, influences our approaches to teaching, learning, education in educational institutions?